let him introduce himself.
Hey, thank you for joining us, everybody. Alex, thank you for hosting this and organizing Startup Chattanooga Week, and very excited to be with this amazing panel of guests. So my name is Victor Huang. I am the founder and CEO of Right to Start. We are a nonpartisan campaign to make entrepreneurship a civic and community priority across the country. We're helping to change minds, change policies, and change communities by making entrepreneurship an issue that everybody cares about, talks about, and actually can enact into systemic change to actually drive policies and improve conditions for entrepreneurs everywhere we go. We believe that you have a right to speech, you have a right to worship, you have a right to assembly, but you also have a right to start. That is, you have the ability to be an entrepreneur, and it's a fundamental right that everyone has, and that we want to be able to spread that and actually encourage cities, states, and the federal government to all participate and encourage that. So I'm a former entrepreneur myself and former head of entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation before I did this work. So I'm very pleased to be able to announce this fantastic panel. We've got five guests, five and a half guests with us here today. We've got the mayor of Chattanooga, Mayor Andy Burke. We've got Patricia Robledo, who's the business liaison with the Office of Business Support in the city of Knoxville. We've got Monty Bruell, who's an investor and entrepreneur, and Brandi Harless, the mayor of Paducah. Mayor Harless, thank you for joining us. And Leslie Scott, who's with the economic development industry in Durham, North Carolina, and is a consultant for other communities across the country. So really an amazing group of people. And what we're going to focus on is this question as we're coming out of 2020, which has not been the most fun year for many people, and it's actually been quite devastating for so many entrepreneurs and has been quite challenging. What can we do looking forward? And specifically, what can cities and mayors do to improve the environments for entrepreneurs? If you look at some of the context around what has happened, early on in the pandemic, over 3 million businesses closed. There are still 1.2 million businesses closed today. And the numbers for certain groups are even worse. For Black-owned businesses, they're over 130% more likely to be shut down. For Latino-owned businesses, almost 30% more likely to be shut down. So the disparities in the system have actually been exacerbated throughout this pandemic. And meanwhile, we still have millions of people that are unemployed. Entrepreneurship really, as we look at businesses that have closed down, is going to be at the very front line of economic recovery. That is, how do we start and restart the businesses to actually grow the jobs back and create the economy? I like to say that entrepreneurship is the vaccine for our economic revival. And so we're getting ready to tackle that question here today. So I am first, before we jump to the panel, we have a guest. This is our half guest, Mayor Greg Scharff, the former mayor of Palo Alto, has sent a video over to us. So I'm going to ask Alex here to cue up the video and show the video, and then we'll hear from Mayor Scharff, and then we'll move.
Thanks everyone for having me. I am excited to be participating in Startup Week Chattanooga. My name is Greg Scharff, and I am the former mayor of the city of Palo Alto, the startup capital of America. Palo Alto is a great city of entrepreneurship because of, number one, great talent. Stanford University is located in Palo Alto. 2, great infrastructure. We have Google headquarters on our southern boundary and Facebook's headquarters on our northern boundary. We also have Tesla's headquarters, which are within the city, and Palantir, which started in Palo Alto and is downtown. We also have great coffee shops and other places for tech entrepreneurs to mingle. We also, 3, have a general feeling that your career is advanced by working up a startup, even if that startup fails. So people are willing to take that risk. So some of the top things I did while mayor to help startups succeed were, 1, zoning. We zoned for incubators, co-working spaces, and we encouraged incubator space at a reasonable price. Having a wide variety of spaces in price and size is very helpful to the tech industry. 2, we supported an exciting tech environment, hosting hackathons, allowing corporate events in unlikely venues such as Palantir's World Conference on the city's golf course, having the city willing to work with local startups to provide data and pilot projects. And 3, we're flexible with startups. We cut the city's red tape. For instance, we allowed a drone startup to get approvals to fly blood to Stanford Hospital. I also wanted to say I'm very interested in reading the transcript of this conversation later, and until then, would be interested in if the panelists could share their thoughts on what's the most important element to encourage a startup culture. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mayor Scharf. That was, having spent a number of years out in Silicon Valley, I know firsthand what that entrepreneurial culture is like, and it really is an inspiration what's happened there over the last half century in terms of entrepreneurial support. But sometimes Silicon Valley can seem really far away and distant and abstract. Let's bring it down home. Let's actually think about what can we do with everybody else. Do any of those lessons from places like the Valley apply, or can we create our own models and actually build entrepreneurship from the ground up in different communities like Chattanooga? So I'm going to first start with Leslie Scott. Now, Leslie, you're based in Durham, but you actually, way back in 2003, actually did an economic development survey of Chattanooga. Can you share this was way back in, almost 2 decades ago, but what were some of the findings about the state of small business then and the state of entrepreneurship in Chattanooga?
So I found the report. It's good to be here with everybody. It was 2002, our fieldwork. I was at UNC at the Keenan Institute at the time, and we were part of a Kauffman-funded initiative called the Regional Entrepreneurship Catalyst, which got canceled actually soon after we had finished our fieldwork in Chattanooga, but we went forward with the study, and we were looking at the entrepreneurial economy in 4 different phases: fledgling, emergent, established, and accelerated. And the short answer is, at the time in 2002, the Chattanooga region we classified as emergent. But if everything that were the existing plans we're talking about got implemented, it would be close to established. Speaking of mayors, at the time we were there, Bob Corker was the mayor, and yeah, he was one of the key drivers of getting this study done. So here's what the recommendations were. And I would love it if any of you from Chattanooga, like Monty or Andy, think about this. Give me the thumbs up if any of these got implemented, or thumbs down if they didn't. We recommended a resource inventory of all the resources that help small businesses that are trying to grow or startups. And that's easy to find and that's posted everywhere. A periodic meetup of the people on the list so they can coordinate referrals and put on joint programs. A focus on workforce development, because there was a feeling that the local workforce wasn't going to be very suited to working and agile enough to really work as a company's growing really rapidly. A regional advisory committee of entrepreneurs. And then here's where the tech piece comes in. And we were recommending an inventory of technologies, technology needs, technology developers in all the businesses, universities, and institutions, so that you could quickly try to do some tech development where it was actually needed and help some companies grow at the same time. So those are the few of the things that we recommended in 2002. And I know a lot of that stuff probably did get implemented, because Chattanooga's done a lot in the last 18 years.
It's really, I visited Chattanooga way back when I was a child, and having visited there again recently, it's just remarkable, the transformation of that community. And it sounds like you were able to take a snapshot in time, and you can see a lot of those differences as well. Next question would be taking up to the present day, Mayor Burke, current mayor of Chattanooga. Since you've been mayor, you've seen Chattanooga expand its startup economy in a significant way. What have been, in your interpretation, the reasons that underlie that? And what has city government done to actually support that and facilitate that?
Well, thanks, Victor, for being part of this. And people like Alex, not just Alex, but also people like him are a huge driver for us. So I think can point to a couple of things. Number one is we actually made entrepreneurism a central focus of economic development. From city leaders to the Chamber of Commerce, the language of entrepreneurism has become a big piece of what we talk about every day. There certainly have been times where our economic development focus has been on things like big tax giveaways, That's not something that's friendly to entrepreneurism, and we continue to play in the sphere of, tax abatements and things like that, but we've shifted from that being our economic development strategy to that being a tactic that we use, and understanding that entrepreneurism and entrepreneurial activity really drives high growth in our community, and particularly a rise in wages. The second piece is that, of course, our ultra high-speed broadband has been critical for us in how we look at this issue, and that has led to what I think has been one of the biggest issues for us, and that is the Innovation District that was begun in 2014. And all these pieces together, alongside a high quality of life, is how you make things go forward. And I'll just note that in January, before the pandemic, Forbes magazine said we'd be the #1 city for new job growth in 2020. Hadn't quite worked out that way, but that's the way we were headed based on a lot of these things we've been doing.
That's fantastic, and I love that idea of shifting your entire economic development strategy around entrepreneurship, and that's an emerging trend we're starting to see in a number of cities. But I'd love to hear from Monty Bruell. You're a local entrepreneur and an investor in Chattanooga, and presumably you've been able to be a recipient of some of the benefits of what's happened in Chattanooga over the years in terms of its entrepreneurial support and development. Why have you decided to stay in Chattanooga, and how has the city actually helped you become successful? And what are some ideas you've heard from peers about what the city could do even more of to actually help the entrepreneurs?
Well, I think Chattanooga is an excellent place to start a business. As Mayor Burke said, we have the fastest internet on the planet. It's not just in one district, but it's throughout our entire county service area. So we have a parallel 10 gig internet platform, no matter where you are in the Chattanooga area. That certainly contributes to our success. Looking forward, to quote Warren Buffett, we find out who's been swimming naked at low tide. And I believe that this pandemic represents a kind of low tide. So I think that we're going to have to, in the future, abandon a kind of field of dreams mentality, like we build it and they will come. I think cities are going to have to be incredibly focused, are going to have to be very strategic in terms of how they position themselves in the startup world. Here in Chattanooga, we are equidistant between Georgia Tech in Atlanta, Vanderbilt in Nashville, University of Tennessee in Knoxville, NASA in Huntsville, Oak Ridge National Labs in Oak Ridge. I think that we are well positioned to be an incredible research and development and joint venture city. And I think we're going to have that kind of focus going forward. Chattanooga, has great advantages. I mentioned our internet platform, but we've got great natural resources too. So we've got 20 miles of the Tennessee River that flows through town. We've got mountains. There's so much to do when you're not working. So we are the package, but I think we're going to have to be incredibly focused as we go forward.
I love what you're saying around leveraging the resources you have, taking the assets and the advantages of a place like Chattanooga and actually working to your advantage, and intentionally doing it, not just hoping for the best, actually making a specific strategy to drive that. I'm curious now about other cities. Mayor Brandi Harless from Paducah, Kentucky. I'm really interested in hearing your story. And by the way, I'm actually a big fan of Fin Gourmet, one of the companies in Paducah that I'm familiar with. But you came from an entrepreneurial background yourself before running for office. What are your experiences in Paducah? How has that experience as being an entrepreneur guided you in leading the economic development initiatives to help the entrepreneurs and small businesses in Paducah, and what's worked in that initiative?
Are you okay?
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And thanks for the question. I was an entrepreneur. I still am an entrepreneur, and I intend to be an entrepreneur after I am no longer the mayor. And in fact, I think being the mayor solidified more than I thought it would, that I need to continue to be an entrepreneur to make the impact I want to make. So I'm looking forward to that. You know, I'll tell you, I actually had the privilege of working for an entrepreneurial development support organization before I became an entrepreneur myself. And that was before I was the mayor. And so I've seen in my community this kind of ebb and flow of interest and focus around entrepreneurship. We are still smack in the middle of a Rust Belt situation here in Paducah. We're in Western Kentucky. We are actually equidistant from Nashville, Memphis, St. Louis, and Louisville. So we do have this kind of interesting regional opportunity, I believe, for our community as well. The same as Monty had mentioned for Chattanooga. But I think in a small town like we are, we sleep 25,000 people and we serve about 100,000 people a day, I always say, because we're a regional hub. But really entrepreneurship has still yet to kind of get its true traction in this community. As the mayor, although I have tried my best to have the impact that we could have. We have successfully done some really great things, and I'm looking forward to continuing. That is, we recruited an organization out of Cape Girardeau, Missouri called Codify to work with our local organization that's becoming kind of our entrepreneurship organization called Sprocket. And Codify has really cracked the code on how you do rural entrepreneurship. That is a big question and a hard formula to put together, but they've really cracked the code. They've built a tech community inside of a small rural community. They've been able to raise $20 million in equity investment. As an entrepreneur, that's been one of the largest hurdles for me living in Western Kentucky. The majority of investors that I talk to are real estate investors. They can't get their head around the tech world. And then when I call up to Louisville or Lexington and make pitches, we're earning that credibility finally as my company is, but it's taken a long time to build trust and confidence that this young person from Western Kentucky has an idea and has the ability to make it happen. So there's a lot of stigma attached, I think, to rural entrepreneurship we've experienced here. And to wrap up, my comments, I think from a local perspective, we are still truly stuck in this idea that manufacturing is going to save us. And one of the good things that we did that I think is helping us change our mind a little bit is we stopped looking to our economic development organization as the answer to all of it. And we finally said, let's quit asking them to do everything from workforce to entrepreneurship to recruitment. And we said, let's break up the pie. And so that's what we've done now. Our economic development agency is solely focused on advanced manufacturing, recruitment, the big economic development bucket. Sprocket is now focused on entrepreneurship. And then actually our city staff are focusing on things like retail development and those kinds of things. So I think that helped a lot because we stopped trying to force culture into an organization that was never going to really adopt those attitudes. So I think that made a big impact as well.
That's so interesting. It does feel like, and I hear this from what all of you are saying, which is that a lot of the traditional tools of economic development, whether it's manufacturing or recruitment or tax abatements, just don't seem to really fit the needs of the entrepreneurs. And there's this gap between the tools of economic development and the needs of the entrepreneurs themselves. And we know from all the research that it's the entrepreneurs that create almost all the net job growth. They create the productivity, they create mobility, they create opportunity. But the tools that we use for governance haven't always fit that. And what you're doing in terms of how you're sort of redefining the way economic development can be thought of in a community is so interesting. I'm really interested in hearing about another town. We also have Knoxville on the line, Patricia Robledo from Knoxville. You've been listening to all these different comments and insights about Chattanooga and Paducah. What studies and insights have you come across outlining the biggest obstacles that entrepreneurs face in dealing with city governments? And how has Knoxville addressed those barriers?
Thank you so much for having me. You had mentioned at the beginning that we had like 5.5 presenters, and I wonder if I was the half. I'm really
the half was the video. That's what I meant.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you and representing Knoxville, Tennessee. So so in talking about entrepreneurship and what cities can do, there's a lot of articles and studies out there, and Knoxville has certainly been looking into the regulatory policies and how we can help entrepreneurs come to be. So Mayor O'Hara, our former mayor, created the Office of Business Support, and I was lucky enough to be the one that she chose to run this office. And I was happy to be with her for 8 years. Now I'm now with Mayor Kincannon, who just was elected a few months ago. I'm focusing on different things right now, but I did want to share with you Mayor O'Hara's idea of the Office of Business Support. It's more like the nuts and bolts of making things happening for businesses. So, you know, we know that business develops and evolves at a much faster rate than we as policymakers can evolve. And so she wanted somebody focused on helping people navigate those processes and help them navigate and be able to exist, right? So a lot of things have come my way, and a lot of them have been like newer business models for which we do not have a framework. We don't have ordinances and such, and so it falls on me to bring the different departments that need to be involved, like the law department and whatever other ones, to either amend or create new ordinances so that those businesses can exist. And you know, something happens when you start saying, I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but we're going to make it happen. And once you do it for one, it just happens for others, and it helps create a culture of saying yes, we'll make it happen somehow. And the idea obviously is not that these regulations are going to be barriers. Obviously, sometimes they are more like speed bumps, but we want to make it happen. So a lot of it has to do, and this has been already mentioned, as far as zoning goes. Our zoning ordinances were 50 years old and antiquated, and so we revamped and overhauled those to make things happen. But in the meantime, while that was being done, we needed to make amendments to them so that things could exist. So for example, I'll just give you an example because I think it's really cool. Little things that we did that made things happen. So, for breweries to exist, they could only do so in industrial areas. And so we tweaked the language so that it would be more like craft breweries and distilleries and such, so that they could move on to warehouse districts and mixed use areas. At the same time, we created the ordinance for mobile food units for food trucks because they were up and coming and such. At the same time, somebody wanted to start a food truck park. Now we have a couple of them, but that was a land use that was really not allowed in our zoning ordinances. So, I mean, we could have said like, sorry, you can't exist, right? But we tried to find ways for them to happen. And I feel like these three things were like cousins growing up together, and they had a symbiotic relationship, and it has added to the vibrancy of the city. So that's just some examples of things that we do to make it happen.
I think that's great. And I love the way, Patricia, you talk about these issues like zoning and food permitting and things like that. And I think the issue that always strikes me about entrepreneurship is, the story tends to be around, well, it's, it's just taxes. Oh, it's just regulatory burden. But entrepreneurship is this issue that cuts across almost every silo in politics. It's around zoning, it's around permitting, it's around capital access, it's around workforce training, it's economic development, it's taxing issues, it's K through 12 education, it's higher education, it's community colleges. It really, you cannot think of an aspect of government and policy that doesn't affect entrepreneurs. In fact, at Right to Start, we created a field guide for policymakers just because there were so many different issues to deal with, and we wanted to sort of help people be able to navigate these types of issues. And so I recommend you check out that field guide if you're interested, for anyone watching. But I want to put this question back to all of you, because how do you actually help entrepreneurs when there's so many things to possibly manage that affect the lives of the entrepreneurs? You can't name an aspect of government, I think, that doesn't touch entrepreneurship in some way. We didn't even talk about healthcare and debt and childcare and so many things. I'll start with Monty Bruell. You talked about this field of dreams approach, and I think in many ways that's kind of what I'm getting at, which is hope doesn't substitute for intentionality and actually driving change. So instead of a field of dreams, what is left to do? Like, what would you consider to be the top things that policymakers should do in a city to actually drive positive change for entrepreneurs?
The first thing that I think that cities can do is to help investors, help the venture capital network to cast a broader net. There are so many people who are talented who don't have access to the entrepreneurial tools that exist right now. We've talked about minorities being underrepresented in the startup community. Women are underrepresented in the startup community. So I think we've got to make sure that we're reaping the benefits of having full participation in our startup culture. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when you're a startup, capital is very, very valuable, and you don't want to take any missteps. I think we often make the mistake of thinking that money solves every problem. And when we have founders who are trying to launch companies and grow and scale their companies, we've got to provide them with great mentoring, with great advice. I think mentoring is super, super important there. And we do that pretty well in Chattanooga, but I think we need to do it, even better. So those are just a couple of ideas about how we can better support startup communities.
I like that, which is full participation. So many of the entrepreneurial systems actually leave out people, certain groups of society. And what happens is that's like leaving money on the table in a game, right? You're actually not taking full advantage of the assets you have. I'm curious, Mayor Burke, in talking about this issue of how do you actually wrap your head around all the things you do, you actually listed some really exciting things that you've been doing, from broadband access to the innovation district to actually shifting your economic development strategy around this. But there's so many issues that come up, right? I mean, there's the capital access issues, there's the zoning issues, all these other things. How do you actually make sure you can stay on top of all the needs of the entrepreneurs in Chattanooga?
Well, I don't know that you can. Just to be honest, I think we've got to listen to people. That's the number one thing that you can do in government. So let me just kind of pull back from that question just a minute and say, I think there's two things as a city leader, as opposed to some other seat. There's a couple of things that I can do. Number one is build a great city. That's the long game. Just build a great city where people want to live, because entrepreneurs want to live in a place that they can really love and enjoy. Thing number two is you have the power to convene. Not every piece of this is government, and government is not good at being, making sure that entrepreneurship happens. We create the conditions that allow entrepreneurship to flourish. And so convening people is really important. So to me, those in the innovation district, for example, in the long run, it was supposed to create density and a convening table where people could come together and have these conversations. And then, let me just say, third, on the tactical side, I think we have not turned a corner, right? We have this really horrific virus that is still hurting lots of people in our community. We had our 5th worst day of the virus yesterday in terms of our numbers. But coming out of this, whenever that happens, you're gonna have tremendous opportunities. Unfortunately, because so many businesses have closed, there are going to be a lot of people who are looking to channel their ideas and their energy into something new. And so we can do a couple things right now. Number one is we have to help people, if they are struggling now, not get into a situation where they don't have access to capital. So right now, there's a lot of things that have to go on with technical assistance so that somebody doesn't end up in a position where they destroy their credit rating. Number two is we've got to do a lot of counseling for people about how they can put themselves in position to grow. And the third thing is, we have put together a number of very small incentives for people to start their own businesses. That's been extremely popular. It's about creating that culture. They're not world-changing incentives, but they are important. But we really, as a country, as cities, one by one, we got to figure out and listen to entrepreneurs coming out of this. Not that government can do everything, but what are the roles that we can play as we enter this really new time, deal with the virus, start to come out of it? How do we get entrepreneurship back on track for people?
I mean, that is such a broad panoply of issues you're talking about, Mayor Burke. And I do like the way you basically say, listen first, because listen first and then convene, because the entrepreneurs and the community around them can help solve the problems, not just the government itself, but the government can create the conditions that make it ripe. Mayor Harless, I'd love to hear about your thoughts in a similar vein. As you think about, the pandemic has just consumed our years and has been so tough for so many communities. But as you look about, what do we do next? How do we get out of this? I think about the end of the movie, The Candidate, when after the election, they look around and say, what do we do now? And I think that may be November 4th in this country. After we get through this election, and we think, my God, we still have millions of businesses shut down. We still have so many jobs that are lost. What do we do now? Mayor Burke was talking about some of the things he's thinking about. What are you thinking about in terms of what happens in Paducah and your community?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Mayor Burke. I think it's always important when we ask ourselves the first question, which is, what is the role of government in anything? There's not always a role of government, not every time. And speaking of Field of Dreams, my favorite analogy for local government is that we are the ones who keep the baseball field grounded. We're the ones who make sure it's maintained. We're the one that make sure that the players can play on the field, but we are not the players, and we should never try to be. And so from my perspective, from a local government perspective, and my role as a city leader is, let's make sure that we are being entrepreneurial in our thinking in City Hall. Let's make sure that we understand how to break the chains of bureaucracy. And, when we talk about zoning and we talk about all the hurdles that an entrepreneur will face, city government can make that better. And in Paducah, for instance, we actually created an entire department called the Customer Service Experience Department. And this department's whole entire job is to make anyone who comes into City Hall, make the opportunities more obvious, make the pathway more clear. We launched these things called Kickstart meetings. So anytime anyone has a project that they want to start, they meet with every single team member that's going to touch their project from the beginning. And they sit in a room for an hour and they talk about that project. And then the city staff gives them feedback to say, here's the barrier you might come up against. Let's solve for that now. It has changed the way we do business. And when I got into office, we had this big problem with the reputation of not being business friendly. And so we have tried so hard to overcome that. We also have an online mechanism where people can start their project online. It's called Open Counter. And they can literally fill out their entire project, and then it spits back a program that says, this is the zoning that you're going to need. This is the permit you're going to need. Here's how much it's going to cost you. And so people can sit at home on Sunday night on their couch, dreaming up their project and figure out how to do this with City Hall. So I think we have to look internally first. One more thing before I wrap up is, as an entrepreneur now, I look back at when I was an entrepreneur, we called ourselves concierges. It was before I had experienced entrepreneurship. Can I tell you that we were wrong about everything? We were wrong about how we assisted our entrepreneurs. Now that I am an entrepreneur, I want to go back to that person and say, I'm sorry, because I made a ton of assumptions about what you needed and I was wrong. And so Mayor Burke said, listen, that is so key. And it has to be truly listening and truly taking action on what you hear, because I think people who haven't lived it and who have not actually taken those risks do not have a clue what needs to happen and what needs to be prioritized. And so a lot of times I think our successes is when we bring entrepreneurs to the table and ask them to help solve these problems for us.
I think that's so powerful what you're saying. I think so many programs that assist entrepreneurs get it wrong. They fail. They're kind of like, I think of them as like those old VCR machines where you had to punch all these buttons and you could never figure out how to use them right. And I think so many governments have tried to provide the equivalent of those machines, but the interface is all wrong, and they're not actually, it's not giving you the functionality and the design that you need. And the needs of entrepreneurs are so varied and wide because they're so personalized and so specific and so context dependent, each single one of them. One person needs, a zoning issue. One person needs workforce issues. Another needs access to capital. And they need all those at different times of the year and different life cycles of their business. So I think that kind of humility is very important. But this panoply of entrepreneurial needs, I'd be interested in hearing from Leslie. You've actually studied entrepreneurial systems and how communities and governments support entrepreneurs. What have you seen across that whole variety of what actually works best, given the context of everything you've heard, and what doesn't work as well? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I want to pick up on what a couple of these mayors said, because an example near me is very local government admitting that we need to listen a lot more than we need to talk, and it's one entrepreneur at a time. And so what they do is they have a standing meeting of all the department heads, local government department heads that affect business, planning, zoning, permitting, police and fire, depending on what type of business it is. And every startup in the community is invited to come to this meeting. That's maybe every other week, a specific time. And if nobody shows up, if no businesses show up, then they don't have it. And now that they're meeting virtually, it's really easy to basically have office hours to meet with the entire, and so one at a time, they do troubleshooting. The business may have tax issues. They may have permitting issues. They may have no idea where to start. They may, be trying to do a business succession for an older to a younger business owner, and a lot of other things. But what it does is it creates a mechanism for listening that they promote in the community that makes the businesses feel better about their community, even if they never go to that. But it's sort of this open listening session. But where the government's role, I think, as Brandi was saying, is to sort of, at least on the get our act together on the service provision side. And the whole reason this is happening in this community is that a business got conflicting answers about whether they could put a wine selling business and a wine serving business on their rural property. And they got 3 or 4 different answers from different county departments about what was even allowable. And the economic developer just basically said, time out, let's have a meeting, we'll get everybody together. And it went so well for them solving their own problems as a local government that they just said, we need to institutionalize this and let the businesses see that we're here to do problem solving with them. We don't just have this posted set of rules that cookie cutter fits everybody, because nobody knows how to, too many, like Victor was saying, so many different situations will come up. The answer is you just listen to them one at a time. Now, in a smaller community like this one I'm thinking of, it's more possible just in terms of the volume. But as you all know, probably, maybe you don't know this, but about nationally, I've found only about 5% of small businesses take advantage of any of the free resources for small businesses that are around them. So the uptake is terrible, but there's usually, so you can kind of count on not that many people showing up even when you offer it, but the people that do really can help become ambassadors for your community for how business friendly they are, one story at a time.
I love the way you're talking about it. Which community is that, with the wine serving versus wine
selling?
So
this is Chatham County, North Carolina, which is part of the Research Triangle region, but is on a big lake, Jordan Lake, and it's basically a bedroom community to Raleigh and RTP.
Interesting. Hearing what's happening in Chatham County and Chattanooga and Paducah, it all seems to be some variation of like agile method, right? It's like governments can be more entrepreneurial when they actually start internalizing the process of entrepreneurship in doing the way entrepreneurs need, which is high levels of responsiveness, adaptation, resiliency, flexibility, which is not the normal way to build this into a system. But I'd be interested in hearing, Patricia, it seems like in Knoxville, you talked a lot about the connections you're able to make, the community you're able to wrap around, the resources you're able to provide. Does this resonate with you, this idea of almost like a nimble, agile model for how you actually respond to the needs of entrepreneurs rapidly?
Yes, very much. I loved hearing everything that has been said. And one thing that that I heard was we need to include entrepreneurs into our processes, right? So I think that we come from it from a very risk-averse kind of filter, and then when you bring the entrepreneurs to the table, and they are more free thinkers, I think they come up with ideas that we as policymakers tend not to think about. And so I wish that we would do more of that. I know that Knoxville, a local tech organization, has worked with the city with a hackathon, and the city has given these civic challenges that we've had, whether it is garbage pickup or parking or whatever, and have them sort of go at it and come up with ideas of how to best solve those issues. We have a vibrant maker community in Knoxville as well, and I know that they want to be at the table to be part of solutions for the city. But yeah, just making things easier. We have pre-submittal conferences, and we have even pre-submittal conferences where people just want to talk about their idea. And I think it's been a great thing to do. We hope to do it more. Institutionalize it is a good word for it, because it should be part of the process. And you cannot underestimate bringing the right people to the table and just having a conversation. I've seen it happen where one person will say, one inspector will say, well, no, you can do it this way. And then the other one will say like, well, but how about if this or that? And they'll think, go back and forth. And so, you can't just be so black and white by the code. And having those conversations really brings up ideas and solutions. And so, yeah, listening, I've heard that word too, very, very important.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. I think it sounds like the way you approach it is it's so similar to and that's what's fascinating to me, is the similarities of the approaches here that all the cities are engaging in. We have a question here from Corey Bisher, who asks, what can the city, I presume that's Chattanooga, do about the numerous buildings that could be used for business hubs by nonprofits, or a space for those who may not have funds to lease a space? Presumably that means entrepreneurs that are starting out, or small businesses. These buildings have been sitting for years. How can we give incentives to private owners to make them usable? And I'm going to start with Mayor Burke on this, because I think this is specifically to what's happening in Chattanooga. Just, I think, but it's more around the question. I'd expand the question a bit, which is, how does a city engage in leveraging, real estate, specifically unused real estate, for the benefit of entrepreneurs? And then I'd also like to hear from the other cities and the other perspectives people have on the call about the same question, perhaps in other communities too. Mayor Burke.
Well, I would say a couple of things. Number one, we do have some incentives in some of our low income census tracts. So if you fit in a low income census tract, you do have some incentives to remodel your place if that then creates jobs in one of those areas. But it is always a struggle for cities like ours, both to deal with blight wherever it may be, but also to understand that that you have real estate issues, and then you have these entrepreneurial issues. So, and I know Victor, you were at Kaufman, and there's a lot of information out there about a lot of conflicting studies out there about whether you should subsidize real estate parcels for entrepreneurship, and what the effect is for entrepreneurial activity. So I would just say, we want to make sure that businesses can start to take over these places. We subsidize some entrepreneurial activity and co-working spaces ourselves to make sure that they're available. We also need and understand that the market has to work. That's part of ensuring that the entrepreneurial activity is what we want. So I think, again, trying to figure out what your priority is. Is your priority to deal with blight, which then gives you a certain set of issues, or is your priority to help entrepreneurism survive? And you might come to two different conclusions based on which one of those is your priority.
I think that it is interesting because what this is really getting at, and I've seen this issue happen in a lot of places, is there's the entrepreneurs that could use the space, but then there's the entrepreneurs that need to repurpose a space to actually make it usable. It's not just something that a government can easily mandate or write a check for. You actually need the entrepreneurs to go through the process of making it into a co-working space or an accelerator, or even as simple as a building that is able to take chances on tenants that may not have dependable track records, or will will lease out small spaces because that tends to have a high transaction cost or high turnover rate. It actually takes a different kind of developer or landlord to do that kind of work. And so I think that again goes to the complexity of these types of issues. I'd be interested in hearing from Mayor Harless about this specific thing in terms of how you deal with sort of real estate development needs to serve entrepreneurs in Paducah, or if any, are you dealing with the same issues that Mayor Berke is talking about, or are you thinking of it differently? Oh, she had to leave. Okay. Monty, I see that you had a comment on this as well. Do you want to share some thoughts around real estate usage to help entrepreneurs?
Absolutely. I have a couple of points to make. The first is that I think we have plenty of incubator space here in Chattanooga. The issue that I see is when a company is 2 years old or 3 years old and is outgrowing the incubator space, there doesn't appear to be affordable space, particularly when we're talking about small manufacturing operations. We've got plenty of office space, but we need, say, 5,000 square foot spaces where companies can graduate to from the incubator. That's really where I think government could take a look at its inventory of surplus buildings and real estate and make a difference there. The second point I want to make is that real estate is a tool, just like capital is a tool. So the bigger question is, what is a city's why? Why do we have the startup community? And I think particularly in cities like Chattanooga, where we have incredible income and wealth disparities between minority communities and the majority white community, what we want to do is build wealth. We want to create vehicles where people in low income and underserved communities can build wealth. So there are a couple of models to look at. Richmond, Virginia created, I believe, the first office of community wealth building in the country. And that was followed by Rochester, New York, who modeled their office on Richmond's. So the question is, can we meet with people to deliver workforce development tools? Can we help entrepreneurs one-on-one, just like Chatham County is doing to help solve their problems? So I think that just thinking that startups are a panacea for everything, we should really ask the question of how do we build wealth in communities where disparities exist today? That's really the broader question that I think cities ought to address, and certainly the startup community plays a role in that.
I think that, ultimately the business from a policy perspective, business creation and business growth is really around how you create, equitable wealth and allow people a fair chance at creating, a better lives for themselves. So that's a really point well taken, Monty. Leslie, I wanted to follow up. You had a comment here in the chat box around state-funded grant programs for building upfit, which I think is really interesting because so many economic development metrics and incentives, and also workforce metrics and incentives, are not geared for entrepreneurship. Like in workforce and some of the economic development, they're actually geared towards, can you count the jobs you create? As opposed to, can you help people create their own jobs and create their own independent livelihoods or create jobs for others, which are really different metrics and actually much harder to count. Can you speak a bit about that, about the disconnect between state-funded grant programs helping, catalyze and subsidize building changes for business growth and economic development?
So the first part I would say is that I would encourage everybody on the call to look at what your workforce boards are doing with apprenticeship, youth, and other dollars that they get, but also for adults, self-employment oriented programs that help you create your own job are actually allowable under the Workforce Investment Act, and more cities and places are starting to take advantage of that, because the problem is on the real estate side, North Carolina has a really good one, a building use reuse program, but it's really geared towards what I would call more small and medium enterprises that are in a growth mode, but they're already established businesses, and they have to make a commitment for, if we can do this upfit, we can hire 3 people, and manufacturing jobs gets you more grant money than retail jobs. And, that's how the guidelines work. But in smaller towns, a lot of times they can't, that what they want is a space where 8 businesses could locate, but no one of them is really an anchor that's ready to make that type of commitment because there's clawback provisions where if that for some reason they don't create the jobs, they have to give back the grant money. And so that's all very awkward. But in most cases where I've seen real estate development in North Carolina in partnership with local government, it's with private investors right next to them. Like Monty was talking about earlier, the private sector is a key partner all the way through. Durham, North Carolina would be nowhere that it is right now if it weren't for the brownfields redevelopment that a private investor who owns the Durham Bulls decided to do when the project got stuck. And so sometimes you need those private dollars to really even move forward the public projects.
I think that is fascinating. Patricia, can you speak to this issue as well around real estate and what you've seen in Knoxville and how you try to respond to the needs of entrepreneurs in terms of space?
Sure. So here in Knoxville, we do have incentives in redevelopment areas. We specifically have the facade program in which the city goes into a private-public partnership and tries to invest in those areas to promote more private investment. We have tried to do a lot of streetscapes and infrastructure to help redevelop these areas. I do think it's, the folks that apply for the grant have to own the building. So, it's not necessarily the business that goes in there that owns the building. Obviously, the city is not, is going to invest in infrastructure, but not necessarily give money to businesses. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And also in these redevelopment areas, there are some challenges. There are areas that have not had infrastructure improvements for a while, and so stormwater regulations and such kick in that make it difficult. So we're working on all of those things. The city also recognized that, for example, we had a building that was not being used. It was in a redevelopment area, and very specifically put it out for bid for use as co-working maker space. So, cities can look and see what stock they have and hopefully try to make it go a certain way.
That is, it is so interesting how cities like Knoxville and all other cities all think about this issue. And I think I didn't want to just focus on real estate, but I do think it's an interesting lens to look at the interconnectedness of all these issues around entrepreneurship. We've got just a few minutes here left, T-minus 3 minutes. I've gotten a message from Alex. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give me a 20-second answer to close this out. So as you look towards 2021, sort of getting out of, as we come out of this pandemic, hopefully things we can pull out of this pandemic, within the next, half year or so. What is your one wish, if you could envision, one change or one improvement or one hope for entrepreneurship city level change or policy, what would that be? So if you could think of one thing you'd really love to, just if you could snap your fingers and make it so to help the entrepreneurs in a city, what would that be? And let me start with, because this is your town, Mayor Burke, let's start with you.
Thanks. And thanks for letting me be part of this, Alex and Victor. Appreciate it and have really enjoyed the comments of the other panelists. Been just right on. If I could do one thing, it would be to improve the educational attainment of our city. That's just that's going to help entrepreneurship more than any zoning change, more than any bureaucratic issue. If we have more people who are obtaining 4-year degrees, getting graduate degrees, getting end degrees like PhDs. I just imagine if you just look at what an average person makes with a master's, and just imagine 180,000 people in our city with a master's degree, be transformative.
Skills, knowledge, for a knowledge-based economy, there's nothing more valuable than the stuff that goes in your head and the skills that you bring to a job. Thank you, Mayor Burke. Let's go with Mayor Harless. What is the one thing, if you could snap your fingers, you would change in your community to make it more supportive of entrepreneurs? Oh, she left. That's right. I forgot that. Sorry. I forgot again. Let's go with Monty. Would love to hear your thoughts. Same question.
I think the one thing that I'd like to change here in Chattanooga is I'd like to change how our city's purchasing function is organized. Currently, city government does not have a preference for either local companies or minority companies. And I believe that the number one goal in buying goods and services of government should be to support local businesses, including entrepreneurs. And so if we as a city just gave a preference to the people who have invested in our community, I think that would go a long way to helping us in a post-pandemic world.
That's great. In our the Right to Start field guide, which I linked to earlier, we actually call for a 5% of government procurement, the government contracts, to go to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs actually have a hard time breaking into a lot of government contracting systems, and just doing a incentive to the system itself to actually encourage entrepreneurial support would be dramatically effective, we think. Leslie Scott, same question. Snap your fingers, one change would you like to see?
I'd like to see the entrepreneur mindset be taught from middle school all the way through many adult education programs, including vocational trades. Everybody that's getting ready to start a professional trade should have entrepreneurial mindset training and think of that trade as their business. I'd like to see economic developers work the supply chain even more than what Monty's talking about, where after, and I saw North Carolina fail to do this, after you recruit Dell, which makes your computer only after you order it, make the supply chain be more local. Keep the company there. Once you land the buffaloes, get them to buy locally as much as possible in terms of their sourcing, because then you're helping all those locally grown companies in your region too. And I haven't seen that many places do it, but it would be fun to work on it and do it.
Fantastic. Patricia, your snap your fingers wish for entrepreneurs. Oh, you're muted. Sorry, you're muted. Yep, there you go.
I just wish things were not so complicated. So I think this procurement issue also goes to the state, right? So the state kind of holds our hands behind our back sometimes in terms of what can be done. But I'll go back to something you, Victor, said at the very beginning, like everybody has a right to start. And I loved that. And I think that, as Monty mentioned about diversity in entrepreneurship and such, I wish we had more of that mindset everywhere, that everybody has a right to start. And it's not just the tech, fast growth companies, but everybody.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the plug. I'll give a very shameless plug for Right to Start. If you go to the Right to Start website, you can join the movement to unleash everyone's right to start just by signing up. Just put in your email. We'll put you on the newsletter. We don't spam people. We actually just send out stuff that's useful. So thank you. Thank you to Alex. Thank you to the entire panel. This has been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it. And we hope 2021 will be a constructive, forward-looking year for all entrepreneurs everywhere. I hand it back over to Alex.
Thank you all again so much for being on the call. I wanted to thank you again to the Company Lab for sponsoring Startup Week, and that's a wrap. I posted the link on the Facebook event page where we'll be posting the video of this webinar shortly. Thank you all again so much.